In the late 90s and early 2000s, HealthSouth, a big healthcare company, got caught up in a huge money mess. This mess, called a scandal, was about $2.8 billion. It led to the boss, CEO Richard Scrushy, and some money bosses called CFOs going to jail. Recently, two of these CFOs, Beam and Weston Smith, talked about what happened at a meeting in New York. They shared their story about how things went wrong and why it's important to be honest in business. Let's hear their story about how money and lies caused big trouble at HealthSouth. Beam recollects he used to watch the TV news in 2003 when they were discussing the scandal. He was on the verge of being arrested in a few days. HealthSouth ventured into medical care out of hospitals at the start, but later concentrated on rehabilitation hospitals, which they have continued to do so far. They went public in 1986, 2 years after they opened, and were swiftly successful. This is when Beam got to work for Scrushy. HealthSouth's Scrushy convinced him to work at the hospital by giving him 100,000 shares for $5,000. The price of the HealthSouth stocks increased greatly, and Beam became a millionaire. He made some sales of stock and bought himself a luxurious car like Mercedes and a big house. In addition, he purchased the most expensive ties and he used to travel in a private jet regularly. Along with HealthSouth's expansion, they took 12 jet airplanes. The guys were greedy. They considered themselves rich. They shopped for good and expensive things and they flew in private jets. People in Birmingham were like stars to Beam, and they were always happy to give him free stuff whenever he was seen. Scrushy was ruthless even to this date. He wanted to be a billionaire at all costs. Their greed led to fraud. Beam said Richard used to meet with analysts every year. He would ask them what we should do to make sure our stock gets a good rating. They would suggest things and he would promise them that we could do whatever they suggested, even if it wasn't what we actually planned. This strategy worked for a while as HealthSouth was making a lot of money. However, Scrushy began promising more than the company could actually achieve, according to Beam. In the summer of 1996, HealthSouth missed its earnings target badly. Beam continued. He and Bill Owens, the company's chief accountant, had to tell Scrushy they had to report the shortfall. Scrushy became enraged and shouted at them, claiming that they couldn't reveal terrible data because the stock would plummet and litigation would follow. "You guys won't be rock stars anymore," Scrushy told Beam. "You know how to correct these figures. Now get back to your offices and do it." Beam stated that he should have said no, but he was terrified of Scrushy. He also did not wish to terminate the celebration. That night, he and Owens tampered with the books. HealthSouth's auditors were unable to uncover the fraud throughout the remainder of the year and into 1997. "We begged Richard to tell Wall Street we were going to have a down year, but he wouldn't do it," recalled Beam. At a meeting in early 1997, Scrushy looked each of us in the eye, Beam recalled. He said he didn't know our plan, but if we were caught, he would deny everything. Beam started hating his job. "I didn't want to be the one to speak out," he said, "but I understood what Richard meant. If you go against me, I'll have more lawyers and money than you." So, Beam decided to retire. Scrushy tried to get him back, saying the fraud had stopped, but Beam didn't believe him, and the illegal activities continued unnoticed for more years. The day after hearing about the fraud on the news, Beam and his wife met with a criminal attorney. The lawyer warned him not to lie to the government because former colleagues had already implicated him. If he lied, he would face many years in prison. In a meeting with the FBI a few days later, Beam learned that 17 people had confessed to the fraud. The only one who denied knowing anything was Scrushy. Surprisingly, Scrushy was acquitted, but later he was convicted on 3 different charges related to bribing Alabama's former governor. He served 6 years in prison. Beam spent only 3 months in jail, which was unexpected, especially compared to others like Owens, who got 5 years. "I don't know why my sentence was so light," Beam said. "I didn't want to stay in prison longer than necessary, but now I'm a felon for life." He said that big companies like HealthSouth, Enron, and WorldCom had bosses who were charming and persuasive. These bosses weren't usually the ones cheating with money. There were many others, including CFOs, who helped. He asked why CFOs would do that. He thought maybe accountants like to work quietly, not in the spotlight, but they might learn that by changing numbers, they could get ahead in their jobs. How they did it. It was Smith's time to talk once Beam had spoken. He didn't do as well as Beam in the end, even though he was the one to eventually expose the swindle. He was found guilty by a separate court and given a 27-month sentence, which he completed in full. At the FEI meeting, Smith took a more technical approach than Beam. He started by explaining that in the healthcare field, there are big decisions to be made about accounts receivable reserves. For example, when you get a bill for a doctor visit, you see what was billed and what the insurance company will pay. There is a big judgment involved in deciding how much money to set aside for future expenses. Every industry has its own similar decisions. What HealthSouth did was manipulate its accounts to make it look like it had more money than it actually did. They understated how much money they owed and overstated how much money they had made. Smith pointed out a footnote on a financial chart and said it was nonsense because he had written it. They also misclassified expenses. Instead of showing them as costs on the income statement, they moved them around to make everything look smooth on the balance sheet. For example, they said they had $275 million in the bank, but they actually only had $25 million. It was like playing a shell game. Another way they cheated was in mergers and acquisitions. They would inflate the value of what they acquired and hide liabilities. Then, when they didn't make as much money as they claimed, they could use these reserves to cover it up. On the other hand, they bought goods and services worth $766 million with only $15 million in their possession. That kind of blunder could be logical for a tech company with its valuable intellectual property. But in the case of HealthSouth, it was just about purchasing regular items. It was all down to their fraud plot. By 2002, HealthSouth's reported figures were hundreds of millions of dollars annually exaggerated. In just one quarter, they were recording fake billion-dollar transactions in the books. Smith and his group could not afford to overlook the increasing danger. "I was so stressed," Smith said. "It was then that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act came out, and I realized that the penalty of 20 years in prison was too much to bear." He thought about quitting, but Scrushy appealed to his emotions. He asked what would happen to the families of company executives if the fraud was found out. And if Smith left, it would look suspicious. If the CFO leaves right before Sarbanes-Oxley is signed, it's like a red flag, Smith explained. Finally, Scrushy compared leading a big company to leading the mafia. "You can just walk away," he told Smith. Feeling pressured, Smith stayed and signed the documents. But later that year, he met with the authorities and confessed everything. "I knew I was going to jail," he said. "I was scared, but I felt relieved that the line was over." Smith lost everything because of the fraud, and it wasn't just him. Many people who had nothing to do with HealthSouth suffered because of it. People's lives were ruined, he said. He ended his talk by urging everyone to live ethically and to expect the same from those they work with.